Part 1. When Flavors Collide. The pre-dawn air in Carborough carried the promise of autumn, crisp and clean, as Zoe unlocked the gleaming silver door of Soul Kitchen. Her breath formed small clouds as she moved through her morning ritual, checking propane levels, organizing mise en place, firing up the griddle that would soon fill the farmer's market with the aroma of Korean spices and fresh corn tortillas. "Good morning, Zoe," called Maria from the adjacent produce stand, already arranging late-season tomatoes in perfect rows. "Smells like you're making magic again." Zoe smiled, tying her black hair back in a practical ponytail. "Just trying to wake up the world one taco at a time." By 7:30, Soul Kitchen hummed with efficiency. Kimchi sizzled alongside marinated bulgogi, while fresh tortillas warmed on the side griddle. The line that formed told the story Zoe had hoped for: university students clutching coffee cups, young families with strollers, and longtime Chapel Hill residents curious enough to try something new. 3 blocks away, Daniel Hunter checked his watch as he approached his usual Saturday morning coffee stop, only to find it closed for equipment repairs. The sign directed customers to try the farmer's market for great local options, which Daniel normally would have ignored, but his caffeine dependency overruled his preference for routine. The scene at Carborough Farmer's Market surprised him. Where he expected a few vegetable stands and maybe some homemade jam, he found a vibrant community hub, and at the center of the longest line he'd ever seen at a farmer's market stood an Airstream trailer with Korean graphics and the unmistakable smell of something extraordinary. "Korean-Mexican fusion," explained the college student ahead of him. "My roommate says the kimchi carnitas taco is life-changing." Daniel's eyebrows rose. Fusion cuisine could go spectacularly wrong, but the enthusiasm of the customers and the organized efficiency visible through Soul Kitchen's service windows suggested otherwise. When his turn came, he found himself face to face with a woman whose confident movements and warm brown eyes immediately commanded attention. She looked up from the griddle, wiping her hands on her apron. "First time?" Zoe asked, noting his hesitation as he studied the menu board. "Is it that obvious?" he said. "You have the look of someone trying to figure out how kimchi and carnitas could possibly work together." Her smile was knowing but not condescending. "Trust me?" Daniel nodded, curious despite himself. "Kimchi carnitas taco with pickled radish and gochujang aioli," Zoe announced as she assembled the order with practiced precision. "My grandmother's kimchi recipe meets my other grandmother's slow-cooked pork. 2 traditions, 1 delicious conversation." The first bite silenced Daniel's skepticism. The tangy fermented cabbage cut through the rich pork perfectly, while the spicy sweet aioli bound everything together with unexpected harmony. This wasn't fusion for novelty's sake. It was thoughtful integration of flavor profiles that genuinely complemented each other. "This is remarkable," he said, meaning it. "Food tells stories," Zoe replied, already assembling the next order but giving him her attention. "My job is making sure they're stories worth telling." "You're Korean?" he asked. "Half Korean, half Mexican. Grew up translating between languages and cultures, learning that the best conversations happen in the kitchen." She handed change to the next customer, then glanced back at Daniel. "What about you?" "I run Harvest and Home, the farm-to-table place on Franklin Street." Something shifted in Zoe's expression. Not unfriendly, but more cautious. "Daniel Hunter. I've heard the name. Local food scene legend, right?" "Hardly legendary, just trying to do good work," he said. "Me too," Zoe said simply. The line behind Daniel was growing longer, and she gestured apologetically. "Duty calls." Daniel stepped aside, finishing his taco while observing Soul Kitchen's operation. Every movement was efficient, every interaction genuine. This wasn't a novelty act. It was serious food service executed with both technical skill and authentic passion. Walking back to his car, Daniel couldn't shake 2 competing thoughts: professional admiration for what he'd witnessed, and a growing concern about what Soul Kitchen's obvious success might mean for his own lunch crowd. Part 2. Competitive Appetites. 3 weeks later, Daniel could no longer ignore the obvious correlation between Soul Kitchen's Tuesday and Saturday farmers market presence and his own noticeably smaller lunch crowds. The numbers didn't lie. His midweek covers were down 15%, with several regular customers mentioning their new favorite Korean-Mexican spot when they did come in. His approach to Zoe began diplomatically. He found her during the Tuesday market's quieter afternoon hours, cleaning her prep station while autumn light filtered through the trees surrounding the parking lot. "Daniel Hunter," she said, looking up from sanitizing her cutting board. "I was wondering when you'd come by for a conversation." "You were expecting me?" Successful restaurant owner notices new food truck drawing crowds. Pretty predictable scenario. Zoe's tone was matter-of-fact rather than defensive. "What can I do for you?" Daniel leaned against Soul Kitchen's counter, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to discuss market positioning, how we might approach food service in a way that's complementary rather than competitive." "Complementary," Zoe repeated, setting down her cleaning supplies. "That's an interesting word choice. What does that look like in practice?" "Different price points, different demographics. Maybe coordinated timing so we're not both hitting the lunch rush simultaneously." Zoe studied his face, reading the subtext behind his diplomatic language. "You're concerned about business impact." "I'm concerned about sustainability, both yours and mine." Daniel's honesty was deliberate. "I've been building relationships with local suppliers and community organizations for 5 years. Soul Kitchen is clearly popular, but food trucks by definition move on. I need to think long term." "And you assume I don't?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Don't you? I mean, the whole point of a food truck is mobility, right?" Zoe's expression cooled slightly. "The point of Soul Kitchen is making quality food accessible to people who might not otherwise experience it. Students who can't afford $30 dinners. Working families who want something more interesting than fast food chains. The mobility is practical, not philosophical." "I didn't mean to suggest that I'm not committed to community, because I am. I just define community differently than you do." Zoe's voice carried conviction without hostility. "I've been in Chapel Hill for 2 months, and I already know Maria's kids' names, which professors order extra spicy, and that Mrs. Peterson from the library prefers her bibimbap without mushrooms. That's not temporary connection." Daniel found himself genuinely impressed by her response. "I apologize. I made assumptions about your approach that weren't fair." "Apology accepted. But let me ask you something." Zoe leaned forward, her brown eyes direct. "Do you really think Chapel Hill can only support one Korean food option? Because that suggests a pretty limited view of what this community needs." "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" Daniel paused, recognizing that his concerns were more complex than simple competition. "I meant that I've worked hard to establish trust with local suppliers, to create jobs for people who live here year-round, to be someone the community can count on. When I see something new that might disrupt that, my instinct is to protect what I've built. And my instinct is to prove that different approaches can strengthen rather than weaken a food community." Zoe's response was immediate and passionate. "Good food makes people more adventurous, not less. When someone tries Korean-Mexican fusion and loves it, they don't stop eating Korean food. They start seeking out more Korean food. Your restaurant benefits from that curiosity." Their conversation continued for another 20 minutes, neither conceding their position but both recognizing the other's genuine care for community and quality. When Daniel finally left, he carried new respect for Zoe's thoughtfulness and a grudging admission that she might be right about complementary rather than competitive impacts. Zoe watched him walk away, surprised by how much she'd enjoyed the debate. Daniel Hunter wasn't the territorial small-town restaurant owner she'd expected, but someone whose questions forced her to articulate her own values more clearly. Both went home that evening with the sense of unfinished business and, though neither would admit it yet, genuine curiosity about continuing the conversation. Part 3: Unexpected Collaboration. The University of North Carolina's invitation to participate in the Fall Food Festival arrived in both their inboxes the same October morning, with a note suggesting they coordinate their offerings to showcase Chapel Hill's diverse culinary landscape. The event coordinator's diplomatic language made clear that having two Korean food vendors competing directly wouldn't serve anyone's interests. Daniel's initial reaction was reluctance. Festival food service meant dealing with massive crowds, limited prep space, and the kind of chaos that made precise execution nearly impossible. But Soul Kitchen's inclusion in the invitation meant Zoe had already established enough local reputation to be considered an essential part of Chapel Hill's food scene. Their planning meeting took place at Harvest Inn Home after Thursday's dinner service, when the restaurant's intimate atmosphere softened the edges of their earlier professional tension. Daniel had prepared coffee and pulled out his festival notes, while Zoe arrived with a tablet full of menu ideas and supplier contacts. "The obvious approach is to divide Korean and Mexican," Daniel said, pouring coffee from a French press. "I focus on traditional preparations. You handle the fusion side." "Obvious, but boring," Zoe replied, accepting the coffee and noting its quality. "Also misses the point of what makes Soul Kitchen work." "Which is?" "That the fusion isn't gimmicky. It's about understanding what makes each tradition strong and finding where they naturally connect." Zoe opened her tablet, showing Daniel photos of her prep process. "Look at this kimchi carnitas. The Korean fermentation process creates umami that enhances the Mexican slow cooking technique. They're not competing, they're collaborating." Daniel studied the images, his chef's eye noting the careful balance of color, texture, and presumed flavor profiles. "You ferment your own kimchi?" "My grandmother's recipe, adapted for larger batches. Want to see?" The next hour transformed their business meeting into something closer to a masterclass as Zoe walked Daniel through her fermentation process, explaining how controlled bacterial cultures created complex flavors that complemented rather than overwhelmed other ingredients. Her knowledge of traditional Korean techniques was evident, but so was her innovative application of those principles to unexpected combinations. "Where did you learn to think about flavor profiles this systematically?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. CIA, plus trial and error, plus growing up translating between my grandmother's cooking styles. Zoe smiled at the memory. One spoke Korean, one spoke Spanish, but they understood each other perfectly in the kitchen. I learned that good food transcends cultural boundaries when you respect what makes each tradition special. Daniel found himself sharing his own grandmother's techniques for balancing sweet and spicy elements, discoveries that paralleled some of Zoe's fusion principles. Their conversation flowed naturally from technical details to family food memories, revealing shared values about respecting traditional techniques while embracing creative adaptation. "We could coordinate our festival menus without duplicating each other," Daniel suggested eventually. "I could focus on elevated traditional Korean dishes, maybe a bulgogi bowl with seasonal local vegetables. You could showcase the fusion approach with tacos and Korean Mexican street food." "That works. And we could share some suppliers. I've been getting excellent kimchi cabbage from Johnson Farm. You probably know them?" "Tom Johnson supplies our seasonal vegetables. Good people." Daniel made a note. "What about logistics? Prep space, timing, shared equipment?" They spent another hour working through practical details, discovering that their approaches to organization and quality control were remarkably similar, despite their different service styles. When Zoe mentioned needing a larger prep space for festival volume kimchi production, Daniel found himself offering Harvest and Home's kitchen during off hours. "You'd do that?" Zoe looked surprised. Even though we're technically competitors? Are we? Daniel met her eyes directly. Because tonight feels more like consulting with a colleague than negotiating with competition. Zoe considered this, aware that the evening had shifted her perception of Daniel from territorial restaurant owner to thoughtful craftsman. It does feel different than I expected. Good different? He asked. Definitely good different, she admitted, and both recognized that their professional collaboration was developing into something more personal and complex than either had anticipated. Part 4. Finding Common Ground. The early morning trip to the wholesale market became an unexpectedly intimate experience, their professional collaboration deepening as they navigated rows of seasonal produce together. Daniel's SUV carried both their orders, and Zoe found herself enjoying his systematic approach to vendor relationships, the way he remembered personal details about suppliers' families, his thoughtful questions about growing conditions and harvest timing. "You're different than I expected," she said as they selected Korean pears from a vendor who clearly respected Daniel's standards. "Different how?" he asked. "More collaborative. I thought you'd be territorial about supplier relationships," she said. Daniel laughed, a sound warmer than his usual reserved tone. "Tom, meet Zoe Chen Martinez. She runs Seoul Kitchen, the Korean-Mexican fusion truck I mentioned." The vendor's weathered face lit up with recognition. "The one making those amazing tacos! My daughter goes to UNC, won't stop talking about your kimchi carnitas." Zoe beamed, and Daniel found himself genuinely pleased by her obvious joy at the connection. Watching her discuss seasonal produce availability with Tom, he recognized someone who shared his appreciation for quality ingredients and fair supplier relationships. Their afternoon prep session in Seoul Kitchen's compact space forced a physical proximity that heightened their growing awareness of each other beyond professional collaboration. When Daniel commented on the efficiency of her mobile kitchen design, Zoe invited him inside to see the full setup. "Everything has to be secured for travel," she explained, demonstrating how equipment locked into place, but also accessible for quick service. It's like designing a ship's galley. Daniel was genuinely impressed by the thoughtful engineering, but found himself more distracted by Zoe's movements in the confined space, the practiced grace with which she navigated around him, the way her voice softened when explaining her grandmother's techniques. "This is your grandmother's kimchi recipe?" he asked, watching her layer cabbage with gochugaru and fish sauce. "Modified for larger batches, but yes. She used to tell me that recipes were like star maps. They guide you home no matter how far you travel." Zoe pointed to the small constellation tattoo on her wrist. "That's why I got this, to remember that some connections transcend geography." Daniel studied the delicate tattoo, understanding for the first time why Zoe had chosen a nomadic lifestyle and how it connected to, rather than conflicted with, her desire for meaningful relationships. "Do you miss having a permanent base?" "Sometimes, but I've learned that home isn't necessarily a place. It's the connections you make and maintain." She looked at him directly. "What about you? Do you ever feel trapped by staying in one place?" The question touched something Daniel rarely acknowledged. "Sometimes I wonder what I might have missed by playing it safe. You've cooked in different cities, experienced diverse food cultures. My world has been pretty contained." "Contained doesn't mean limited," Zoe said gently. "You've built something meaningful here. I've seen how your staff talks about you, how suppliers trust you. That's not containment, that's commitment." When Daniel reached overhead to help Zoe retrieve a large mixing bowl from Seoul Kitchen's upper storage, their faces came unexpectedly close. The moment stretched between them, loaded with recognition that their attraction had evolved beyond professional admiration into something more personal and complex. "Zoe," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "I know," she replied, her brown eyes reflecting his own uncertainty and interest. I feel it too. The air between them hummed with possibility. The festival was still days away, but something had already begun. Something that had little to do with food service and everything to do with the way Daniel's careful reserve softened around her, the way Zoe found herself wanting to stay in one place for the first time in years. We should probably focus on prep, Zoe said finally, though she made no move to step away. Probably, Daniel agreed, also not moving. But Zoe, I'm glad Tom Johnson introduced us to each other properly. Her smile was radiant. Me too. Part 5. Recipe for Love. Festival day arrived with perfect October weather, clear skies, crisp air, and the kind of golden light that made Chapel Hill look like a postcard. The setup process revealed how naturally Daniel and Zoe worked together, their different approaches creating a rhythm that maximized both efficiency and quality. When the propane delivery truck arrived 2 hours late, threatening to derail their entire timeline, Daniel's systematic crisis management kicked in. While he coordinated backup supplies and revised cooking schedules, Zoe handled increasingly anxious festival organizers with calm reassurance and creative menu modifications. We can prep the Korean barbecue bowls using your kitchen equipment, Zoe suggested, already calculating timing adjustments. And I can modify the taco filling to work with what we have available. That'll put us behind schedule, Daniel pointed out, though he was already moving to implement her suggestion. Better behind schedule than disappointing customers, Zoe replied, firing up Soul Kitchen's backup burner. Besides, we make a good team. The first rush proved her right. Lines flowed naturally between Harvest and Home's elevated Korean bowls and Soul Kitchen's fusion tacos, with customers often ordering from both vendors. Daniel watched Zoe handle the chaos with impressive grace, expediting orders efficiently while maintaining genuine connections with customers, particularly the families and students who clearly recognized her as more than just another festival vendor. Having fun? He called during a brief lull between rushes. More than I expected, Zoe admitted, wiping sweat from her forehead. Look at this. Mrs. Peterson just ordered extra kimchi for her book club, and that kid from my Tuesday regulars brought his whole family. This feels right. When the afternoon brought their biggest challenge, a delivery mix-up that left both vendors short on key ingredients, they adapted with the kind of seamless collaboration that surprised even them. Daniel's extra bulgogi became filling for Zoe's emergency Korean-Italian fusion wraps, while her leftover kimchi elevated his simple rice bowls into something special. We're making this up as we go, Daniel said, laughing as they invented new dishes on the spot. The best cooking happens when you trust your instincts and your partner, Zoe replied, then paused at her own words. Daniel smiled at her. Partner. I like how that sounds. Their success exceeded both their expectations and those of festival organizers. By evening, they'd sold out of everything, earned enthusiastic praise from customers and fellow vendors, and demonstrated that collaboration could strengthen both their offerings and their community impact. As they cleaned up together, the festival's string lights creating intimate pools of warm light around their vendors' area, both felt the satisfaction of shared accomplishment mixed with something deeper and more personal. I have a confession, Daniel said as they loaded the last of Soul Kitchen's equipment. I've been thinking about what you said, about home being connections rather than places. And I think you might be right, but I've also been wondering if the right connection might make someone want to stay in one place longer than they originally planned. Zoe set down the container she'd been carrying, giving Daniel her full attention. That sounds like a leading question. Maybe it is. Daniel stepped closer, his usual careful reserve replaced by quiet confidence. These past few weeks working with you, It's reminded me why I fell in love with cooking in the first place. Not just the food, but the connections food creates between people. Daniel, she said. He kept speaking. I know your lifestyle requires flexibility. I'm not asking you to change that, but I am asking if you'd consider making Chapel Hill a regular stop. Maybe we could explore what this partnership could become, both professionally and personally. Zoe felt her heart racing as she processed his words. What are you suggesting? That I base Soul Kitchen here seasonally? I'm suggesting that we figure it out together. Maybe Soul Kitchen anchors here during the academic year and travels during summers. Maybe we develop a small plates menu for harvest and home that incorporates some of your fusion techniques. Maybe we just see what happens when two people who cook well together try building something more than just great food. The kiss that followed felt as natural as their kitchen collaboration, carefully considered but genuinely felt, tasting of possibility and shared dreams. When they separated, both were breathing unsteadily but smiling. For the record, Zoe said, her hands still resting on Daniel's shoulders, I've been thinking the same thing, about partnerships and places and the difference between moving because you have to and moving because you want to. And what conclusion did you reach? He asked. That the best recipes combine familiar ingredients in unexpected ways to create something better than the sum of their parts. She smiled, touching his face gently. I think we could create something pretty amazing together. I think so too, he replied, kissing her again under the festival lights, surrounded by the satisfaction of shared success and the promise of all the meals they had yet to cook together.